Great. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Another exciting day of Mike. Okay, test 1, 2, 3. How's that? A little better? Okay. First test of the day. There'll be many others. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us again this morning for another exciting day of ComNet. I think the proceedings so far and the session so far have really been quite extraordinary in terms of a focus on some really practical, hands-on sessions about how we do our work and how we can improve doing our work in terms of our sort of constant effort to be better at what we do and have a bigger impact. Someone that's going to help us with that this morning with some really interesting views on the changing world, the changing dynamics of communications is Jay Rosen, and it's really a pleasure to have him here to speak with all of us. Jay is a professor of journalism at New York University. He's been on the faculty since 1986, and he also served as chair of that department. He lives in New York City. He's author of Press Think, which many of you I know are familiar with. It's a blog about journalism and its many trials and tribulations. He introduced that back in 2003, which confirms that he's an early adopter of blogging and has been doing it for quite some time. In June 2005, Press Think, his blog, won the Reporters Without Borders Freedom Blog Award for outstanding defense of free expression. And in April, Press Think recorded its 2 millionth visit, so plenty of people are paying attention to what Jay has to say. He blogs also at Huffington Post, and in July 2006, he announced the debut of newassignment.net, his experimental site for open source reporting projects, and the first project was Assignment Zero, in which he collaborated with Wired.com. Jay is also a member of the Wikipedia Advisory Board, and in 1999, Yale University Press published his book, What Are Journalists For? A question that many of us ask almost every day, I guess. And it was really about sort of the rise of citizen journalism or civic journalism or public journalism or whatever you want to call it. But Rosen wrote and spoke frequently and speaks frequently about this topic. And it's something that, as we all know, really has a continuing and growing impact on, I think, the work we do each and every day. So you get the point. Jay's obviously a thought leader and an opinion leader on sort of the new tools and new ways of communicating that affect the work that we do each and every day. And I think he's really keyed in on the huge opportunities that the new tools present for individuals to kind of break through and to organize virtually and collectively to have a much bigger impact on sort of public and social agendas. So a few of us got together with Jay last night and had a chat with him about some of the things he's working on. And he was very interested to learn about the challenges we face and some of the obstacles that we face in our work and the range of challenges, including, many countries where, freedom of the press is simply not part of the equation. But I think what Jay's going to talk about today really sort of breaks through and crosses many of these boundaries of expression that we face in our work. And he's going to talk about how the powerful handle scrutiny from the press and the public. And what he has to say is not only fascinating, but it's really very pragmatic and practical to the work we do. So an honor and a pleasure to welcome Jay Rosen to the podium.
Good morning. How many of you good people have Twitter accounts? Raise your hand. Pretty good. How many of you have used Facebook for bank business? Good. How many of you have ever written and posted a blog post without editing from anybody? Not bad. How many of you have ever heard the battle cry of hackers and bloggers everywhere that it's better to beg for forgiveness than to ask for permission? You ever heard that? That's one of my philosophies. I hope it's one of yours. Better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. You get it? On Twitter, I'm JRosen_NYU. 35,000 people follow me. You can do that too. You don't need permission. My blog is called Press Think, as Carl said, and I invite you to take a look at that. This talk is on the record, open, transparent. I teach journalism. I study new media and how the press is changing. I have a PhD in media studies. I'm not really a member of the press. I'm more an anthropologist of the press tribe, so I study them. I did my dissertation on the rise of the thing that we call the public as the body on the receiving end of journalism and news and information. And I study sort of the history of that idea, the public, not the people, not the masses, not the crowd, not the audience, but the public. And that's remained very central to what I do. My own philosophy of journalism is that the more people who participate in the press from the public, the stronger the press will be. I had some reason to reread my dissertation in preparation for what I wanted to talk to you about today. And I'll explain why in a minute. But first, there's no PowerPoints, no data, no charts, no video. I'm just going to present a few ideas for you in about 30 minutes, and then we'll have an equal time for questions and answers. I want to identify for you 4 distinct strategies that the powerful have for handling scrutiny from the press and increasingly from the public itself. You could also say that these are historical phases in the relationship between the powerful and the press, but they are all still with us, and they emerge and disappear in different ways in different settings. And I'm not going to describe them in great depth because I think you'll recognize each one of them from your own experiences, from institutions you've worked at and bosses you've had. The first strategy, the simplest strategy, the powerful have for handling scrutiny from the press and the public is simply hiding from the press. And in fact, before the 20th century, that was the most common strategy, is simply not to appear in public view at all. And the thinking here is simple. No one knows what you do, therefore no one can question you. Hiding from the press. It's pretty easy to understand. A simple example would be criminal gangs. That's their publicity strategy, is they don't want to appear at all. And they want no one to know that they exist, but they're powerful. Another example would be, tell me if this is familiar in your own experience, the boss who simply says, keep me out of the newspapers. Right? So that's one way of handling scrutiny, is hiding. A second strategy, a second phase, I would call impression management, which is also called public relations, or public information, or public affairs. And here, power, instead of hiding, tries to control the image people have of it through the limited release of information. Whatever public relations people say they're about, what they actually do is they try and limit and control the information that is available both to the press and through the press to the public. So here the strategy is to appear in public, but in a controlled fashion. And the art and science of public relations is, in fact, the art and science of that control. Now, the shift to public relations typically comes when hiding from the press doesn't work anymore, when it becomes impossible, typically because of the growth of media systems themselves. An outstanding example of this, and a fascinating one historically, is the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which is an appropriate subject to explore a little bit here, since I just learned that I'm standing on international soil. That's a first for me. It really feels great. So in 1919, nations of the world, not all the nations of the world, but those that were the victors and kind of friendly with the victors, gathered in Paris at the close of World War I to decide what to do about Germany and the redivision of the world in Austria-Hungary. And up to that time, when you had big diplomatic conferences, the diplomats and the heads of state could get together in a room and sort of decide what was going to happen, whether it's a treaty or a new balance of power. And when they were done, send letters home and tell other people. And that was kind of the way international diplomacy worked up until the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And at that event, something unusual occurred, which is all the leading power brokers, especially from the United States, France, Britain, had with them people who now we would recognize as public relations advisors or publicity advisors. And also gathered at Paris were journalists, reporters, to report on the peace negotiations. And what happened was that because of the telegraph, which was now integrated into the news system, the reporters could send back news accounts of what was happening in the negotiations while the negotiations were underway. And not only that, but word of what was being talked about as a possible settlement of the chaos of World War I would, of course, appear in the newspapers at home, and reaction in the domestic public would feed back through the telegraph to Paris. So that the diplomats trying to negotiate a workable peace were suddenly confronted with a new factor, which was the reaction of their home publics to what was being proposed and discussed before it was actually decided. Therefore, they had to appear to the people at home to be strong, demanding, insisting on fairness for the French, for the British, for the Americans. And that's why the publicity advisors were there, see, to control the information so that the people at home got the right impression. But this, of course, rebounded into the negotiations themselves, complicating them immensely. And when this happened, it was new. Now, it's routine. But that's the shift from hiding to impression management. And it comes about because the media system is expanding. It's reaching more people. It's growing faster. The speed of communication is the speed of electronic media itself. And politicians and statesmen have to adapt to those new conditions. So that's the second phase, impression management. The third phase, which is very apparent now and very visible today, is transparency and openness, a different strategy for handling scrutiny. Here, power takes the risk of opening its books and sharing with the public and of course the press, the same information it uses to understand itself. The same information it uses to understand itself. So here the strategy is not hiding, it's not controlling the image, it's to release and decontrol information. And of course, there's a lot of risks to that. Because when you release and truly decontrol information, all kinds of things can be discovered about you or said about you or put together about your own business. Now, a simple example of shifting to transparency and openness is a newspaper I know, the Spokane Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington, a few years ago, decided to put its editorial meetings online by webcasting them. So every day, the editors sat down at their table to decide what should be news today, what are we working on, what should we be working on, and they actually literally opened it up to public viewing by webcasting it. So anybody could see the editors deciding on what's news. And they also invited any member of the public who wanted to literally sit in the room with them to sit in the room with them. Okay? Obviously, they took a risk. Right? A simple joke about an unfortunate news event, which happens all the time in newsrooms, since journalists have very black humor, they're very sarcastic, they make fun of people in the news all the time behind your back. A simple joke could kind of disturb the image of professionalism that people may have of journalists, but they took that risk for a reason, and the reason was to increase trust. So there's a relationship there between taking a risk and gaining trust, and the editors in Spokane felt it was worth it. But there are many other examples that I'm sure you've talked about, like the whole open data movement, putting your information online, broadcasting yourself. Those are all attempts at transparency and openness. The fourth strategy is the least well understood, it's the least talked about. It's under-theorized, it's under-scrutinized. We know about it, but we rarely look right at it. And that is secrecy by complexity. Here, power tries to elude scrutiny and accountability, not by hiding from our gaze, not by presenting an image, and certainly not by openness and transparency, but by making it impossible to figure out what's going on inside complex and frequently gigantic systems. It's not that the information is hidden. It's not that it's manipulated. It's simply too opaque for anyone to understand. That's a way to avoid scrutiny. Sometimes we kind of capture this strategy a little bit with the phrase hiding in plain sight. Do you know that phrase? It's something like that, but it's more intricate than that. And of course, we just lived through an outstanding example of secrecy by complexity with the collapse of the financial system, right? Most of what was going on in the United States, but also lots of other banks around the world, with these complex financial instruments that ended up in financial disaster, was too complex for regulators, for the press, certainly for investors, many of the partners of financial institutions, to understand. And that was the idea. In fact, in many ways, these financial instruments that brought us to such ruin were too complex for the people operating them to understand. Right? And that's a big reason why we're in the hole that we're in. So secrecy by complexity is actually a very high risk strategy that may be invisible to the people using it themselves. Now, I don't work in international development. I don't know that much about your business, but listening to a description of this group and what you do and the bank last night at dinner, it did become clear to me that your main business is legitimacy. You're in the legitimacy business. That is showing, proving, maintaining, improving the legitimacy of the bank and what it's doing, which is a very valid thing to do because big institutions need legitimacy. Otherwise, all they have is naked power. So if we think of my 4 strategies in terms of legitimacy as a overriding aim, in hiding from the press, the statement is, I don't need legitimacy at all. That's what the criminal gang says, right? We want to be effective, we want to be rich, we want to be undeterred, we want to be flexible, we want to be powerful, but we're criminals. We don't need legitimacy, right? In impression management, the statement is, let's protect our legitimacy. We need to protect it through the control of image and information. Under the regime of transparency and openness, the attitude is we need to build, rebuild, or build up our legitimacy. So when you need more, you try transparency and openness, which takes work and involves risks, as I said. And with complexity, it's more like legitimacy? Actually, we didn't think about that when we set this up. But you're right, that's a good point. So all I want you to do is think about these 4 strategies and how they connect to your experience and fill in your own examples. Right? Now, to conclude this presentation, I want to give you Rosen's new media maxims. These are maxims that I use to understand what's going on in new media and that I will share with you because they help me get a handle on how the world is changing, which it is very radically today. The most famous words ever written about freedom of the press are in the United States Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press. The second most famous words ever written about freedom of the press come from the pen of the New Yorker's great press critic A.J. Liebling, who wrote, "Freedom of the press belongs to those who own one." Right? So today, freedom of the press still belongs to those who own one. But new media means anyone can own one. And that is a big change. To me, it's a very good change, but it also means a lot of chaos and reorganization. So that's number 1 of Rosen's new media maxims. Secondly, open systems don't work like closed systems. Open systems don't work like closed systems. What I mean by an open system is, it's very simple. Anyone can sign up. Twitter is an open system. Anyone can sign up. You don't even need, as I said, my permission. Right? Getting into the World Bank offices at 1818 Street is not an open system. Right? Anyone can't just walk in. But WordPress.com, anyone can walk in. And you can have a blog in 10 minutes. So an open system simply means that anyone can sign up. And we should not expect open systems to behave like closed systems, where there's a gate, where there's a guard, where there's a qualification, where there's a control. And if you take practices, attitudes, and assumptions from a closed system and you transplant them into an open one, you should expect them to fail and produce nothing but pain and misery. People do it all the time because they don't listen to Rosen's maxims. But I'm telling you that if you take assumptions, practices, ideas, attitudes from a closed system and you just dump them into an open one, pain and misery will result. Because open systems don't work like closed systems. They can work together. They are not enemies. They are not necessarily each other's destroyer, but they are different. Third maxim. Today, and this comes from my friend Dave Weiner, who is the co-founder of blogging, podcasting, and RSS, among other things he's done. Today, the sources can go direct. The sources can go direct. What this means is all the people who have traditionally been sources for journalists, who appeared in the newspaper because they were important or expert or authoritative or on the scene, those people now can be publishers themselves, obviously by getting a blog, and many of them do. Experts don't need to reach the public through the press. They can reach the public directly. That's what a blog is. The blog simply means you can set up your page on the network, and that page is within reach of every user of the network. That's the amazing thing about the web. That's what we have to preserve. That's what the telephone companies want to take away. Right? Lots of people don't like the fact that anyone can reach the public because they used to be the ones who could reach the public exclusively. Right? So sources now can go direct, which changes the relationship between sources, journalists, and publics. That's my third maxim. My fourth maxim is audience atomization has been overcome. Audience atomization has been overcome. And this is what I mean. In the age of mass media, we got accustomed to a certain arrangement of people in space. And the arrangement that we grew accustomed to is one transmitter, many receivers. Control at the center, consumption at the edges. People at home or in their separate stations, whether it's their cars, their offices, their houses, receiving information and connected up to the press, to big institutions, to power, to king, to the president. Connected up, but not connected across to one another. That is the normal condition that the audience, or if you will, or the receiving public is in under conditions of mass media. But today, with the internet, with blogging, with social media, people are connected across to one another as effectively as they are connected up to big institutions. A simple example of this is, incredibly banal example, is tweeting during the Academy Awards, right? Where people are watching television, they're watching one of the most important ceremonies of Hollywood, the ultimate in big media, but they're also talking to each other across in social networks at the same time. So the ability of the people once reached by big media to connect to each other is one of the things that's really changing our world. And the falling costs for people with the same interest or stake to find each other and create a home for their common interests online is another factor that's really changing our world very rapidly. So if you assimilate these maxims, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, and now, because of new media, anyone can own one. Open systems don't work like closed systems. If you expect them to, you'll get nothing but misery and failure. The sources can now go direct, and they will, and they do. And audience atomization has been overcome. If you assimilate these and work them into your thinking, you will be smarter. Smarter. I don't work in international development. I'm not a consultant. I don't have anything to sell you. I don't have a contract with the World Bank. I don't have an investment in what happens after here. I'm just telling you the way it is, so believe it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jay. That was certainly thought-provoking and humorous, informative, and I think it's going to generate plenty of questions. So have at the microphones, and Jay's here to respond. So please. Not all at once, but just please come to the microphone. And maybe if you could, for Jay's benefit, just kind of let him know where you work and just a little brief.
Hi, thank you for coming, sharing with us. I work in the Office of the Publisher here at the World Bank. I'm a consultant. I'm interested that a lot of people are concerned with all the newspapers folding, that the traditional media we've depended on for so long is disappearing, and that what's left is very subjective, people blogging their own ideas, their own thoughts, and especially internationally, that a lot of bureaus are closing their offices, and that we won't get all the information we've been getting, and just wondering your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay. So the old bureau system was great? Okay. It's true, what you said. The newspaper business in particular is in an economic crisis. It was a long time brewing. It has 4 or 5 different causes, and so it's not easily solved. And one of the consequences of that is that these very large quasi-monopolistic institutions that were able to make a great deal of money from one thing, like providing classified ads, and use it to subsidize another thing, like international coverage, can no longer do that as easily. And as a result, we have several crises, and the one you mentioned is one. The international coverage is a victim of the reduction in revenue at major news organizations. So is coverage of state capitals, for example, in the United States, and other beats like education and religion are all contracting within traditional journalism. At the same time, you have this expansion of new media, and some of it is very subjective, as you say. Some of it is low quality, repetitive, not very authoritative at all. But I think, on balance, lowering the barrier to entry in publishing is going to be a good thing for both journalism and for the people who depend on it. And what we have to do is figure out the right hybrid forms between the old closed systems and the new open systems, as well as ways of supporting serious journalism outside the old structure of making money on classified ads and subsidizing foreign bureaus with it. And that means there's going to be a larger role for other institutions in supporting serious reporting, information collection, and commentary. And that includes nonprofit institutions, NGOs, foundations, in some places where it can be done safely, governments. I'm not a particularly enthusiastic supporter of that, but some places it works. As well as what some people call the gift economy. The gift economy is where the person who wins is the person who gives the most away, rather than the guy with the most toys or cars or riches or biggest bank account. And that's not an answer to everything, but the providing of public goods to the public because it's good, as with open source software, as with Wikipedia, where almost nobody is paid, is itself a very powerful force and could be a powerful force in journalism.
Jose.
Good morning. My name is Jose Bassat. I'm from Barcelona, Spain, but I work here at headquarters of the World Bank. I like how you describe yourself as an anthropologist of the tribe. And I wanted to ask you a question now that with the crisis of traditional media and thousands of journalists losing their jobs, you see a strong movement of journalists to government, to big organizations, foundations, the private sector. And my question to you is how this big migration is changing not the media landscape, but society as a whole. What are the effects of this big move of professionals from media to the rest of kind of governmental and non-governmental organizations?
Right. Well, a few things on that. First of all, I sometimes like to think of a journalist as simply a heightened case of an informed citizen. What journalists are good at, things that everybody should be good at. Knowing how to collect information, knowing how to verify what you are told, which is actually the key skill in journalism, verification. Communicating clearly so that you don't mystify people. Explaining how things work. Being accurate. Being fair. Telling stories so that others can understand what's going on. Those kinds of skills that journalists specialize in are not actually the property of any particular profession. They are things that people everywhere need to learn how to do, unless they're in the business of deceiving, manipulating, lying, dominating, people. And that's a big business. And so that's part of why it's actually not very hard for journalists to find places in other organizations, because the skills they have are actually extremely valuable. Secondly, in let's say the golden age of public relations, the thinking never fully articulated, but nonetheless there, was that the media system and the journalists inside of it, they take care of informing the public. The public kind of sits there and gets informed. And we, as the information officers or the public relations people, we can just try and influence or manipulate the journalists, and if we win, if it works, then the public will be informed kind of with our point of view. Right? And everything kind of works because the media system works. And what's happening today is that no one believes that anymore. Because, speaking now about not the international or global system of states, but the media system, we live in a multipolar world where there are many sources of information, many centers of power, and there are also many institutions and players capable of acts of journalism. So let's take a very important activity like reporting on human rights violations. Very important. Who's qualified to do that and able to do that today? Well, certainly a reporter for ABC News who happens to be there when human rights violations take place or in country can do that. But the people on the ground to whom it is happening can also do that. NGO workers who know what's happening can do that. They have the tools. They have their eyes and their ears, which are the most important tools in journalism. They have a way to hook up with the international network or media system, the web. They have mobility with systems like Twitter. And all we need to do is teach them some of the virtues of journalism that I mentioned earlier. Get it right. Be accurate. Tell the story in a way others can understand. Don't spin. Don't lie. Don't shade the truth for the good of the cause. Just tell us what happened. And I think all those former journalists who now are fanning out into other institutions can bring those virtues to those institutions, but only if they are themselves interested in what I call transparency and openness.
Okay, we have, let's go with Melanie then, and John.
Morning, I'm Melanie. I'm working on communications for the Africa department. The bank, listening to your maxims, the bank has been traditionally more part of a closed system, being more opaque to external audiences, and we are now trying to become a more open system, opening up our information, giving access of formerly closed information now to the public. Following one of Rosen's maxims, how can we avoid misery and suffering in doing this?
Good question. I love this idea of a maxime. That's like better than a maxim. It's like a maxime. My first answer is you can't. Like, you should expect it. You should expect that there will be problems. There will be hassles. There will be people in your institution who freak out. There will be mistakes. And there will be losses of legitimacy in the sense that if you are really open, some things you're doing that aren't that great are going to be exposed, right? So you should expect that. That's my first answer. Second answer would be, before you decide on the course of openness, you should make a very careful analysis of how you depended on opacity in the first place. Lots of institutions that are opaque don't actually think of themselves as opaque. That's not part of their self-image of what they do. It's not part of their self-conscious strategy. But if you are in fact going to shift away from opacity, you should first understand what utility opacity had for you in the first place. And if you do that, you'll be able to predict some of the chaos and misery that's going to result. Most people don't do that because they don't want to ever admit that they were opaque in the first place. They want to buy their own public relations. And I understand that because it's cheap, right? To buy your own public relations because you made it, so you don't have to pay anybody to do it. But it's a mistake. So that's another answer. And the third answer I would have is, if you can take, and this is hard for bureaucracies, this is hard for big institutions, it's hard even for my institution, like a Department of Journalism at NYU. If you could take an experimental attitude toward openness, in which you lower the cost of failure first before you try anything. What I mean by lower the cost of failure is you don't declare everything in the World Bank suddenly open 24 hours a day, right? You just take one part of the bank and you experiment with that and see how it goes. And then you move over to another part that you can make more open. And if you lower the cost of failure so that you can genuinely experiment, reverse course, try something else, tell yourself, that didn't work, let's stop that, then you may be able to reduce some of the pain and misery. Vaccines, I love that. I'm definitely going to use that. That's fantastic.
Some encouraging words from Jay for all of those engaged in the Access to Information effort that's about to hit us on July 1st. We are throwing the doors open more widely, so we'll look forward to a little misery and pain in the process. Right. Let's go to the gentleman here, and then we'll come to John.
My question is about secrecy by complexity. Basically, what I want to say here is that sometimes sophisticated macroeconomists in the IMF or in the World Bank might give prescription to a government, which is similar to a medical specialist prescription to a patient. And the lay person might not have the capacity to even determine whether that prescription is right or wrong. So that complexity is a necessary complexity because it is sort of created by the level of education and the level of professionalism and sophistication that person has and the confidence he has to give that prescription. And sometimes the prescription works, and sometimes it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. For example, in the 80s, the IMF prescribed structural adjustment to a lot of countries without considering a lot of context. And to some extent, it failed. Similarly, in many cases, when HIV and AIDS became a big global issue, the AZT drugs, was prescribed, and it had a lot of side effects. And later on, subsequent inventions are now coming up with new drugs that have lesser side effects. But then the journalist has the conscience, or let's say the citizens' journalism, or even journalists who might be sophisticated enough to analyze those type of prescriptions. How do you see citizens' journalism and even professional journalism who specialize in analyzing those issues at that level? How do you see them at play in that kind of scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an incredibly difficult and important problem, what you described there. And let me just try to pull it into my own words and then perhaps work with it. So the problem is, what happens when a prescribed course of action, because of the problem that it's grappling with, is too complex for the people who are supposed to benefit to understand? Because they don't have the necessary background knowledge required to grasp why this is a good solution or good measure to take. And we can say in response to that, well, public education, but often that's unrealistic. Making everyone able to understand complex systems is not actually a progressive idea because it, in so many cases, will fail. So that's the condition where elites control the knowledge necessary to understand what those elites are doing, and the people that are kind of thought of as the masses don't. That's a situation ripe for manipulation and mystification of those elites, right? However, there are several other steps that we can take, short of trying to bring everybody up to the level of the aeronautical engineer or international economist, right? that I think would address that situation. The first is, in between the superclass of experts at the top and your average citizens at the base of the pyramid, there are other levels. And these are provided by observers, experts, academics, NGOs, activists, sometimes bloggers, people who care and know enough to be able to evaluate what the experts are saying. Now, this is a small group. It may be as small as 1% to 2% of the public, but it is a large group in comparison to the people who are making the decisions, right? And so we might call those attentive publics or sophisticated publics, as opposed to the broad public. So one thing is, explain it to them. And if they can understand it, that's a good sign, because those people are at least a semi-proxy for the larger public. A second answer is that if a recommended course of action is complex and it's counterintuitive and it's hard to understand why we're doing this without understanding like all these other things that might take you 3 years of university to understand, you can at least lay out in public on the web your reasons. You can establish metrics for evaluating your strategy that are public. You can share the data you're collecting to know whether your strategy is working and make that public. You can do what's doable to make it very clear to anyone who does have the requisite knowledge what your strategy is, why you're following it, how to know if it's working, and what to do if it fails. Now, many people who make these kinds of decisions don't even do that, right? So we can demand that. And finally, the third answer I would have is, there are people who are gifted at taking complex systems and explaining them to people who don't necessarily have all the background knowledge necessary to understand those systems. That is one of the greatest talents that a good journalist has, but sometimes that skill is not limited to journalists. That's a great politician. Bill Clinton is great at that. Other leaders are sometimes really good at that. And those people are extremely valuable. So that's another way of doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. My name is John Garrison, and I work on what's called the Global Civil Society team. And I have to deal with all those inconvenient NGOs who criticize us so often. And we've had a history, of sort of antagonistic relationship with groups like Greenpeace and Oxfam and others who, from time and again, criticize different policies or projects. And so I was wondering if you follow that at all from afar, and what advice you would give us in terms of what's the best way to respond to those kinds of critiques, which often can be exaggerated or off the mark, but also oftentimes have a grain of truth in them. So what's the best way of dealing with that? Thanks.
Well, what's the strategy now?
Well, the strategy now is to bring them inside and dialogue with them and face to face. But there's also the media side, which they'll go to the media and give misinformation, and then we don't exactly know if it's best to respond to every negative report that comes out or just to ignore it. I guess maybe the litmus test is, in a sense, is if other media pick it up, then we respond. Otherwise, we tend to just ignore some of the statements that come out.
Right. Well, first thing I would do is I would, and maybe you already have this, I would develop a core, C-O-R-P-S, of World Bank bloggers who are responsible for explaining the bank, following news about the bank that appears, tracking criticism online as it emerges, aggregating and curating the best of that coverage and criticism, participating in online forums where people are discussing the bank and may, in fact, be circulating misinformation, engaging with critics and giving them not only the bank's view, but access to information by which they could check the veracity and validity of the bank's view, and otherwise participating in the online dialogue where the legitimacy of the bank is open to question. And obviously, you would want these bloggers to specialize by areas like environment and finance and other key areas that the bank deals with regularly. And they should become known as World Bank bloggers who are good bloggers. And it's a very hard job. I wouldn't do it until I'd sort of studied how to do it well. But you could look at the career of somebody like Robert Scoble, C-O-B-L-E, who used to be Microsoft's blogger. And if you looked, now he's on his own, but for a while he worked for Microsoft and he was their kind of head blogger. And if you went back, and which I would recommend you do, is make a case study of how he operated, that would give you kind of a template for what I mean. So that's one thing, is get real bloggers and give them, this is going to be the hardest part, real autonomy to do what they do. And that, of course, will include sometimes a blogger saying, you know, I don't really understand the bank's position on this either, but I'm going to get more information for you. Okay? So that's one area. Another thing I would do is, it's obvious from listening to your question and from listening to the conversation last night at dinner that sometimes you people think that criticism that you hear from NGOs and others of the World Bank is legitimate. And sometimes you think it's not, right? So I would do that. I would sort the criticism into fully legitimate, half true, right? And totally illegitimate. And I would publish my rankings. Publish the rankings. And make them current and keep them current. So that I could come to the World Bank, worldbank.org, what is it?
Worldbank.org.
Okay, worldbank.org. And I could see current criticisms, click. Legitimate. Right? Link, 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 link. With a little comment. Half true. Right? Meaning they have a point, but they exaggerated this, they forgot that, you know. Half true. Like kind of a gray scale, you know. Illegitimate. Like, and this is nonsense, right? And for the illegitimate column, it's not only here's what these people are saying, but this is untrue, and here's our proof. Why? Here's our documents. Don't take our word for it. Look for yourself. Look at the data. Look at this study. Look at what this scholar said. Look at what this government study said, right? So that it's not just, you're just not rejecting them, you're allowing an intelligent observer to see why you have placed them. And then if they change their criticism, move them over, right? So that's what I would do. It would work. It would be interesting. It would be very useful for journalists, right? But you probably won't do it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Edie Wilson, and these days I work in the World Bank Institute. I think someone probably will do it, even if we don't do it. It's an interesting idea, and I thought that was an incredible riff. Of really good ideas. We do a lot of what you're saying in terms of blogging. We'll do a lot more, little behind the curve, but coming up there, right, Carl? I agree a lot with what we'll now call les grandes maximes de Jay. So we can just elevate those up there a little bit, but even further. But you're a professor in a journalism department. I think you are, in order to make a broader point, I mean, I totally agree that citizen journalism and citizen social media and citizen dialogue with governments and institutions and, much more ability of all sorts of people to join in the conversation because they have things to say and they know things. I couldn't be more excited about seeing it happen. But I'm not excited to see journalism, important journalism, falling apart. And I think there are very significant public policy implications, and we need to be talking about them. The ability of a major journalistic institution to put hundreds of thousands of dollars into a really important investigation and to go on for 2 years if that's what it takes, to go up against power in a way that citizens can only begin to suggest doing and occasionally do, to understand serious macroeconomic issues and be educated, pushing peers. I mean, Martin Wolf, I'm going to miss not having, I can replace a Martin Wolf in the sort of dialogue that we have about international development with just anybody who's, taken a course in, at SAIS. So let's be really honest with each other about what we might lose and how we make sure we don't. And I know there are a couple of studies going on right now, including, how many, I understand about 1,500 journalists away from perdition and falling off the cliff in terms of some serious, journalism of the kind that I'm referring to. And that's not a good situation. I respect those people enormously. They're my friends, they're my colleagues, they're the people who help the world understand what places like these do.
Yeah.
So I want to get you to talk about that.
Sure.
The other side is I'd like a little bit more, I'd like to push back. Communications has done a lot of other things in this past 50 years that you're not giving us credit for. We have spoken truth to power. We have pushed for the release of information. People have a right to make their best case in the court of public opinion, is how I've always looked at it with my clients. All right? The court of public opinion gets to do the deciding. Not the powerful, not just the institutions or the corporations or whatever. But it isn't illegitimate to help people who don't know how to communicate very well try and say, this is what I am trying to do, all right? And this is the best I can say about it. And let's at least get that out there and see if people will buy it. And sometimes people laugh right in their faces and say, you think that's a great idea. We think that's a really, really rotten idea, all right? But on the other hand, they go, oh, if that's what you're trying to do, yeah, okay, but next time could you try talking to about it, explaining it first? So the act of explaining, where communications, professional communications people, professional journalists have both got, as groups, a lot to be proud of in the last 50 years. Now we have this huge new world to be part of, and that's fine too, but let's be clear about what we might be, needing to take on into that world.
Okay. Well, I'm into most of that. Yeah. It's very true what you said, that if we lose professional journalists who can spend years on hundreds of thousands of dollars and their expertise on really understanding a hidden story that needs to be brought to light, if we lose that, we're not only losing something very valuable and essential in a democracy, but we are guaranteeing an increase in corruption. I think we should be clear about that. If you withdraw professional scrutiny from a sphere, corruption will increase in that sphere. And that is definitely something that we are in for, with the losses that we're seeing in journalism. So we shouldn't overlook that. We shouldn't romanticize the shift in power that is also undermining media empires. And I try not to do that. if you go back and you look through my remarks, you won't find me saying that citizen journalists, bloggers, and these new players replace what professional journalists do. I never say that. People constantly remind me that they won't replace them, and I agree, they won't. And so we have to find ways of supporting what professional journalists have done because their economic model is collapsing. We also have to find ways that some of that scrutiny can happen even if we can't find a new business model for journalism. So to take one example, if all the earmarks in the United States Congress, which is sort of special favors for constituents that are put into the budget, if all of those are actually put online and are open and anybody can see them, you don't need a reporter digging into the earmarks because openness itself will handle that problem. Now that's only a single example of what I mean, but there are other ways of getting to the same ends that we used to get through investigative reporting, but we still need investigative reporters and we still need ways of accomplishing what they did. And I think it's irresponsible to wax enthusiastic about the new world of blogging and social media and citizen journalism without registering the fact that we are also losing something of great value. On your points about professionalism, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know. The professionals brought us the mortgage crisis, you know. They didn't serve me very well. The press didn't stop it. The people with Harvard MBAs didn't stop it. I mean, if I was a professor of finance in our greatest business schools, I don't know, I'd slit my wrists or something at this point because of what my graduates went out and did to the rest of the world. I mean, it's like, it's unconscionable. So I would dissent a little bit from you in this respect, is I think something went awry in 20th century professionalism. That something, I don't know exactly what it was, but there is something about, we're the experts, we know, let us handle it, we'll protect you, we'll inform you, we'll understand even if you don't. There was something about that system that went awry, and we have to go back and fix it. And now we have the tools to do that. And I'm more focused on that than I am glorifying the greatness of our knowledge professions.
On that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. We're out of time, but I would like to offer my profound thanks to Jay on behalf of all of us here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.